The largest source of primary energy worldwide and the primary source of most of the world's fuel is crude oil. Around 88 million barrels of oil are consumed a day, making up 30.1% of the world's primary energy. Crude oil is used to make lubricating oils, jet fuel, asphalt, and diesel. Oil and fuel have become a very important part of our daily lives and the economies of countries. But recently, there has been a cold oil war going on. OPEC member countries, especially Russia, have decided to cut down oil production and supply to Europe, and this will lead to many homes in Europe suffering in winter. This will bring about an economic collapse in Europe. Russia is the biggest exporter of oil to Europe. Industries have already begun to shut down and panic is already rising in parts of Europe. All these show how important oil is to us. This has made Europe start looking for other sources of oil reserves. We have made a list of 15 countries in the world with the biggest oil reserves. These are countries that Europe can decide to do business with. Countries that produce a lot of oil are more likely to have geopolitical leverage over countries that don't, and with fuel being the primary source of energy in the world today, countries in the Middle East and the rest of the OPEC can influence energy prices for the entire world. Today we are going to be looking at the top 15 countries with the world's largest oil reserves. 15. Brazil. Brazil has the second largest oil reserves in Latin America with over 12.7 billion barrels, amounting to 1% of the world's total reserves. It produces an average of 3 million barrels of oil per day, which is more than enough to meet the local demand of 2.5 million barrels per day. Over 94% of Brazil's oil reserves are offshore and close to Rio de Janeiro. 80% of all reserves are also found there. 10% of the nation's oil reserves are found off the coast of Espírito Santo state, which is home to the second largest collection of reserves. 14. Qatar. Qatar is home to 25.7 billion barrels of oil reserves, amounting to just 1.5% of the world's total reserves. The Duqm field is the only one of its oil fields that isn't offshore. In 2021, the nation produced 1.9 million barrels of oil equivalent per day, and its reserve-to-production ratio was 36 years. The North Field is where Qatar produces the majority of its condensates and natural gas liquids. The 300,000 barrels per day Al Shaheen oil field in Qatar will be operated by Total under a new 25-year contract. The announcement was made by Qatar Petroleum, which is in charge of all hydrocarbon activities in Qatar. 70% of the new joint venture will be owned by Qatar Petroleum. 13. China. China is one of the few countries in which the majority of the oil reserves are imported rather than mined. China has the 14th largest oil reserves in the world with over 26 billion barrels, or just over 1.5% of the world's total reserves. The amount of crude entering or leaving strategic and commercial reserves is not made public by China. However, a rough approximation can be produced by subtracting the total amount of processed crude from the total amount of crude available from imports and domestic production. On May 2022, crude imports were 10.8 million barrels per day, while domestic production was 4.1 million barrels per day, giving refineries a combined total of 14.9 million barrels per day. On May 2022, refinery throughput was 12.7 million barrels per day, down 10.9% from May 2021. This was the largest reduction in at least 10 years. A shortfall of 2.2 million barrels per day results from subtracting refinery processing from the available crude. 12. Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan has the 12th largest oil reserves in the world, with 30 billion barrels, or just over 1.8% of the world's total supply. With 1.7 million barrels produced daily, Kazakhstan is the second largest producer of oil among the former Soviet nations. It also has the second largest proven oil reserves. However, Kazakhstan mostly relies on pipelines to transport its oil to overseas consumers, due to the fact that it is a landlocked nation without direct access to international sea lanes. People sometimes point to Kazakhstan's abundant energy supplies as a potential route for Europe to receive oil and gas without going through Russia. Many worry that Russia may try to sway European foreign policy by exploiting the continent's dependency on Russian energy. 11. Nigeria. Nigeria has the second largest proven oil reserves in Africa and the 11th largest in the world, totaling about 37 billion barrels or over 2.2% of the world's total reserves. Nigeria was the top oil producer in Africa in 2021 with an average production of 1.8 million barrels of oil per day, with the Niger Delta accounting for the majority of that production. Nigeria is also Africa's largest economy. It heavily depends on oil as its primary source of foreign exchange earnings and government income. Crude oil is thought to account for 83% of total export earnings and 70% of fiscal revenues. 10. Libya. Libya has the greatest oil reserves in Africa and is the 10th in the world, with 48.4 billion barrels, amounting to 2.8% of the world's total reserves. Due to its low cost of oil production and low sulfur content, it is designated as sweet crude. Libya's geographic location also provides closeness to European markets and low cost of oil supply. For these reasons, Libya is regarded as one of the world's most desirable oil regions. The difficulty facing Libya is maintaining production at existing oil fields while also discovering and developing new oil fields. Due to prior sanctions and disputes with foreign oil corporations, most of Libya is still underexplored. The Petroleum Law of 1955 was the first piece of legislation to permit oil well drilling in Libya. The main oil corporation in Libya is the National Oil Corporation. By providing Libyan officials a share of the oil profits, former president and dictator Gaddafi was able to maintain the continuity of his reign. Gaddafi used this tactic out of fear of an internal uprising against him. To ensure the loyalty of the officials to Gaddafi, oil profits were utilized as bribes. This led to widespread corruption, which ultimately resulted in civil unrest. 9. The United States of America. With over 68.8 billion barrels, or just over 4% of the world's total reserves, the United States is placed 9th in the world in terms of oil reserves. The United States Department of Energy keeps a stockpile of petroleum for emergencies called the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The 714 million barrel capacity of its underground tanks in Louisiana and Texas make it the greatest emergency supply that is known to the general public in any country on Earth. After oil supplies were disrupted by the 1973 to 1974 oil embargo, the United States established the Petroleum Reserve in 1975 as part of the international agreement on an international energy program to lessen future supply shortages. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, as opposed to a stockpile of refined petroleum fuels like gasoline, diesel, and kerosene, consists mostly of crude petroleum. The Department of Energy oversees the Northeast Home Heating Oil Reserve and Northeast Gasoline Supply Reserve, two facilities where the United States keeps certain extra supplies of refined petroleum fuels. However, the government does not keep gasoline reserves of the same size as the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve aims to provide protection for the U.S. against disruptions in oil supplies. 8. The United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates is the world's 8th in terms of oil reserves. It has 97.8 billion barrels, or over 5.6% of the world's oil reserves. Abu Dhabi is home to nearly 96% of the nation's 97 billion barrels of known oil reserves. A daily average of 3.2 million barrels of liquid and petroleum are produced in the UAE. The UAE economy continues to be heavily dependent on hydrocarbons, with 13% of exports and 30% of GDP coming directly from the oil and gas sector. Oil and gas export revenues, which make up the vast majority of the UAE government's income, are still an important source of income for the country. As the first Arab nation to adopt a net zero emissions target, the UAE has prioritized the energy transformation. 7. Kuwait. Kuwait is a small but wealthy emirate nested between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. It has over 101.5 billion barrels, or over 5.9% of the world's oil reserves. The Kuwait Petroleum Corporation, or KPC, a state-owned business, is in charge of managing the nation's oil industry. The K companies are the collective name for the various businesses that KPC operates beneath. The Kuwait Oil Company mostly handles upstream operations. The Kuwait National Petroleum Company is in charge of downstream activities. The largest business in terms of income and in charge of producing oil is the Kuwait Oil Company, or KOC. By 2040, the Kuwait Petroleum Corporation plans to raise its daily oil production capacity to 4.8 million barrels. Additionally, the KPC declared plans to boost natural gas production to 4 billion cubic feet per day by 2030. The actual implementation of various upstream projects, such as the construction of a heavy oil capacity of 60,000 barrels per day, will determine future output growth. 6. Russia. Russia has the sixth largest oil reserves in the world, with over 107.8 billion barrels, amounting to over 6.2% of the world's oil reserves. The Soviet Union's demise caused a severe decline in Russia's petroleum production, which has only just begun to recover. Total liquid output peaked in the Soviet Union in 1988 at 12.6 million barrels per day. By the middle of the 1990s, it had decreased to about 6 million barrels per day. Many commentators credit the privatization of the oil sector for the turnaround in Russian oil production that started in 1999. The use of Japanese technology, higher global oil prices, and the revitalization of aging oil fields all contributed. Although it was expanding more slowly than it had from 2002 to 2004, Russian output had returned to 9.8 million barrels per day by 2007. Today, oil output is around 9.7 billion barrels a day. 5. Iraq. Iraq has well over 145 million barrels, or 8% of the world's oil reserves. From 2013 to 2019, Iraq's crude oil output increased by 1.7 million barrels per day, reaching an all-time high of 4.7 million in 2019. Iraq's crude oil production decreased to less than 4.1 million in 2020. In order to adhere to the Opec Accord, Iraq voluntarily decreased its supply of crude oil in the second quarter of 2020. Iraq's crude oil production increased to an average of approximately 4.4 million in the first half of 2022 as a result of the OPEC members' decision to undo the significant production curbs implemented in 2020. These production projections take into account crude oil produced in the Kurdistan regional government-governed, semi-autonomous northeastern part of Iraq. Iraq's economy is mostly based on the export of crude oil. According to the International Monetary Fund, 92% of Iraq's total government earnings in 2019 came from crude oil exports. Iraq's oil revenues increased to more than 75 billion in 2021 thanks to rising oil prices, up from 42 billion in 2020. 4. Iran. Iran has the fourth largest oil reserves in the world, with over 157.8 billion barrels, or just over 9.1% of the world's oil reserves. 20% of Iran's GDP comes from the oil industry, compared to 29% in Saudi Arabia, 44% in Kuwait, and 45% in Iraq. Iran is second after Russia in terms of gas reserves, with 1,133 trillion cubic feet, or 17% of the world's total. It produces 6.5% of the world's gas, making it the third largest producer behind the United States and Russia, even though most of it is used locally. In order for the Iranian oil industry to realize its potential for output, according to the recently appointed Iranian Minister of Petroleum Javad Auji, it would require investments totaling $160 billion. Iran's present production levels are less than half of what they were during the Shah era, when it produced over 6 million barrels a day and held a market share of 21% within OPEC and 10.3% globally. Prior to 2021, Iran mostly relied on the Crude export terminal, which has a loading capacity of 8 million barrels a day in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran opened the Jask terminal in the Gulf of Oman in the summer of 2021. 3. Canada. Canada holds over 168.1 billion barrels of oil, making up over 9.7% of the world's oil reserves. This statistic reflects the oil sand reserves that, according to government regulators, can be economically produced with current technology and prices. The oil sands resources in the Canadian province of Alberta contain more than 95% of these reserves. Alberta is home to the majority of Canada's conventional oil reserves, as well as almost all of its oil sands. The remaining portion is mostly distributed across neighboring provinces and regions. Particularly large oil production and reserves are located in Saskatchewan and Newfoundland's offshore regions. Alberta holds 39% of Canada's remaining conventional oil reserves, followed by offshore Newfoundland with 28% and Saskatchewan with 27%, but Alberta's share rises to almost 98% when oil sands are taken into account. 2. Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has over 297.5 billion barrels, or 17.2% of the world's oil reserves. At present rates of production, this would equate to more than 50 years of output. An oil barrel is defined in the oil industry as 42 US gallons, which is equivalent to 159 liters or 35 imperial gallons. The eastern province is where most of the oil reserves are located. Prior to Venezuela's January 2011 announcements that it had boosted its proven reserves to 298 billion barrels, these reserves were reportedly the greatest in the world. About 1/5 of the world's conventional oil reserves are in Saudi Arabia. 40% of the declared reserves have been produced in the past, and a significant portion of these reserves come from a small number of very large oil fields. 1. Venezuela. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. Keen viewers would already know this, as it was mentioned a bit earlier that Venezuela surpassed Saudi Arabia in 2011 to become the country with the largest oil reserves. Venezuela's proven oil reserves stand at over 303.8 billion barrels, or just over 17.5% of the world's oil reserves. In addition to conventional oil, Venezuela also has oil sand deposits that are almost equal in size to those of Canada and the world's conventional oil reserves. Although the Orinoco oil sands in Venezuela can be produced using more traditional methods since they are less viscous than the Athabasca oil sands in Canada, they are too far buried to be reached by surface mining. The Orinoco Belt's recoverable reserves are estimated to contain between 100 billion and 270 billion barrels. So, there you have it. Those are the top 10 countries with the largest oil reserves in 2022. Thanks for watching till the very end. Leave a like and also don't forget to subscribe so that we can continue to bring you all the details on the most trending topics on the continent of Africa and around the globe. See you in our next video.